Thanks everyone for joining us on today's webinar, Navigating SOCI and Essential 8 in Australia's healthcare ecosystem. Oftentimes, operational technology is a vast field of security, but healthcare has some very unique challenges when it comes to this industry vertical, specifically around the topic of compliancy. And compliancy is now a facet of business operations that some organizations just can't ignore anymore. And whether you're new to the operational technology landscape or a veteran in the space, you're going to get a lot out of this webinar. Thank you to the Connected Health team for inviting me over to host this webinar. For those who don't know me, my name's Marcus. I'm part of the Wavelength Channel Enablement team, working in the operational technology and security operations space. And I'm very, very happy today to be joined by Jason, Clarity's field CTO. Thank you, Jason, for being with us today. I'm going to let Jason introduce himself in a second, but before that, I'm just going to run through a brief agenda and some housekeeping for everyone. We're obviously going to begin with a little introduction to digital transformation in the healthcare space and making sure that we highlight the increased attack surface and government regulations. We're also going to examine the state of healthcare and the healthcare market and look at all those risks associated with connecting medical devices and IT systems together. We're also going to delve deep into the Australian regulatory landscape, which is a growing topic. That's going to include the SOCI Act and, of course, Essential 8 and their implications on healthcare. Definitely going to be touching on the Essential 8 cybersecurity strategies. We're going to be outlining that for you so you can get a better understanding of what those expectations are, along with the ASD Secure by Design guide. And then we're definitely going to delve into Clarity's approach to healthcare CPS security, focusing on in-depth visibility, exposure management, and those compliance outcomes. For those who haven't joined our past webinars, just some housekeeping as always. Feel free to put your questions in the question box to the right, and I'll endeavor to answer them during the webinar. If not, we'll always make sure to answer those after the webinar. This webinar is going to be recorded as well, so if you want to watch again or a co-worker's missed it, you'll have that opportunity to watch. There's also some great supporting resources that are available to download to help you facilitate everything that we discuss in the webinar on the right side of the screen under the materials tab. So let's get straight into it. But first, I'll let Jason introduce himself. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Marcus, and thanks for the introduction. I think you pretty much covered off Clarity pretty well. But so yes, as you said, I'm the field CTO for Asia Pac and Japan. So I spend a lot of time working with customers throughout our region, and each of those different countries has their own challenges, not just from a healthcare perspective, but obviously a range of other areas as well. So for those of you who don't know Clarity, Clarity is a cybersecurity company that specializes in protecting cyber physical systems, so across industrial, healthcare, and enterprise. And we basically were founded in 2015. We're headquartered in New York, and we really focus on operational technology, so Internet of Things, Internet of Medical Things, and other assets that are vital to operating critical infrastructure and operational environments. So we certainly have a great solution in healthcare through the acquisition that we made of Medigate a number of years ago, and that's allowed us really to expand into clinical device management, MDMs, operational efficiency, those things specific to healthcare. So the Clarity solution is really strong across, I guess you could say 4 or 5 key areas. The first one being asset discovery and visibility, so knowing what you have and really diving deep into context, what that asset actually is, what it's doing, what it's supposed to do, what are the key parameters we look for. We then look into obviously threat intelligence and exposure management, so looking at what's in those key healthcare environments and working out what are the key exploited vulnerabilities that can be used within the environment or exploited in the environment based on the device types and the security mechanisms you have in place. And obviously then we move into the things such as, reporting, secure access, that type of stuff. So really looking across the board in terms of the fleet of key medical assets that you have and providing protections across those.
Awesome. I guess we will go straight into it then. Jason, let's give everyone a overview of the healthcare space in operational technology, and we know that some people are at different maturity stages of their
Yep,
operational technology journey, so probably a good idea to give everyone an overview.
excellent. Let's do it. So look, really there's expanded connectivity through the number of devices being added to obviously clinical environments has meant that there's a lot of push around data transformation and getting better connectivity within healthcare delivery organizations. So hospitals, clinics, medical offices are really adopting new and innovative technology. And those really are used to try and delve into providing better patient care and delivery, which is ultimately the goal. So the more we move into digital health and telemedicine, patient engagement programs, etc., those workflows then start to adopt further technology. But what we're seeing is, yes, it's great to go down the path of adopting these new technologies, but the expansion has increased the attack surface across those environments at a time when cybercrime is easy to perpetrate, tools that they're easy to download, and healthcare being a really a top target because of the types of information that are possible within those environments, but also the impact that it has potentially on patient safety. And as a result of that, we're moving into a situation now where there's more regulatory pressure. Governments around the world are really acting because they see the risk of this expanded connectivity, and they're trying to create frameworks and regulatory compliance acts that are hopefully guiding healthcare organizations towards a path of better compliance from a security standpoint, but also creating a baseline of making sure that the critical, I guess, assets in that clinical situation are being protected by best practices. That's really the goal, is hopefully not to make it onerous, although sometimes they can be, but to give some basic guidance around how we can protect those particular assets in the field. And where it's really come from is we're seeing disruption. So if you look at the trends, let's go back to sort of 2010 to 2017. Breaches in healthcare typically were privacy violations. There was really a focus on extracting data security from ransomware, and that was the main goal of the initial breaches that we saw in healthcare environments. The biggest turning point for the industry was really WannaCry because of the impact that it had across not just countries, but all of the different medical assets and device types that were in those environments. So, data breaches were really around grabbing data, privacy violations, and that really got a lot more regulatory scrutiny from governments around, okay, we see an issue here. But now as you move into the years past 2017, because of WannaCry, a lot of the issue that we see now is around care disruption. So if you look at the attacks on the right-hand side that had been sort of 2020 onwards, they have all been around getting into systems that potentially contribute to loss of life. And we saw obviously examples of loss of life with some of those examples you can see on the right-hand side. So the ability to move across environments and jump across from IT into OT environments, east-west movement was key. And that's what we started to see. So that's caused a situation now where we now know that cybersecurity is basically patient safety. So we've moved away from it being all about data and moving into what do we do to protect our patients from potentially risks of cyber attacks in those environments. And as a result, you can see here on the left-hand side, that connectivity of IoT devices mainly has pretty much tripled since in the last sort of little while. So we see a lot more connectivity. By 2029, we're expecting to see IoT connections in healthcare of about 40 billion assets globally. That's a huge number. So healthcare being increasingly targeted because of ransomware, some of those IoT devices aren't necessarily made for those clinical devices, so they need extra controls to be put in place. And that's increasing, obviously, the threat activity, not just around connected medical devices, but obviously the lateral movement from IT solutions, building automation systems that hospitals and clinical environments have, and those IoT technologies really create a situation where there's a raft of different attack services that we need to look at. And again, that then creates regulatory pressure. So we see FDA, and we see NIST, and obviously with our own government here releasing SOCI and those other acts, we're starting to see pressure to hopefully negate some of the bad practices that we may have seen in the past around lack of protections, but also providing organizations with, here's a great protective mechanism that you can put in place to hopefully alleviate some of the pain. So when we look at CPS in a modern healthcare network, there are four, I guess, key things that we've identified as part of the State of Healthcare Security Report that you'll be able to download as part of the webinar. And this is across the fleet of customers that we have seen at Clarity. So if you look at where we see most impact, 14% of devices that are IoT are operating while they're unsupported or end of life. So that opens the door for exploits that have been around for quite some time. 23% of devices involved in clinical care contain at least one exploited or exploitable vulnerability. So again, we talked about patient safety. Having devices in a clinical environment that have an exploitable vulnerability that can be exposed because of lack of control is obviously a key part of the risk we're trying to mitigate. 65% have been impacted through badge devices. So building automation systems that form part of hospital and clinical network. So it's not just about the typical IT controls. We're talking about industrial controls in a healthcare setting that create that expanded threat landscape. And I think the biggest one here, I won't read them all out, but the 30%, this one strikes to the heart of, are we as vendors providing the right information to customers to go and alleviate the pain? So if you're getting a list of CVE scores in your environment saying, go and deal with these, most of the time you're not going to look at those because that could be thousands of things wrong and they may not even be applicable to your environment. So how do we look at addressing what we call the CPS blind spot by narrowing down that focus, and we'll talk about later in the presentation, around known exploited vulnerabilities versus just CVEs to give you a much better outcome around what you're trying to address from a security standpoint.
Jason, a question for you that's probably quite important for the audience. I know we've mentioned this before on past webinars and you briefly just touched on it. I think it's really important though. Data breaches on healthcare organizations have been really highly publicized. So it's definitely no surprise that the healthcare industry is a target to threat actors for various amounts of reasons. Compared to other industry verticals that use operational technology and CPS devices, can you explain to the audience that extra level of complexity that healthcare has when it comes to securing medical devices compared to other industry verticals securing their operational technology? We have a real heightened emphasis on patient care and safety, but we
Correct.
also have problems such as complex supply chains and devices requiring clinical context when upgrading and updating.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it's one we get asked a lot. So thanks for raising it. But look, I think if you look across all of those industrial verticals, utilities and healthcare, the two that stick out for being ones where that extra care and extra protection is required. So on the utility front, if someone jumps into one of the water providers and doubles the amount of chlorine that goes in the water, that's a risk to the population. So they're the things we talk about. On the healthcare side, it's probably a little bit more, it's more risk averse because those operations are 24/7 for the most part. They actually contain or remain controls around patient safety. So imagine being in theatre and something goes wrong with one of those infusion pumps. That's an issue. That's patient safety in real time. So the issue around patient safety and healthcare in general is the types of devices that are used, because there's obviously heightened controls required because of what they're actually doing from a task standpoint. But also there's not the same segmentation that you might see in an industrial environment from a network standpoint. So typically we would, air gap, or we would segment those assets away from key devices. So if something was able to breach the environment, we'd have other controls in place. Medical is still quite a flat structure. So the requirement for medical is identifying device types. And where it's challenging in healthcare is that the device types that we typically see don't necessarily run on the same protocols as IT tools would discover. So there's a lot of protocol discovery that obviously we do from a clarity standpoint to identify those devices and grab that context. So the issue or the heightened uh, difficulty in healthcare is typically dealing with the different types of protocols that are leveraged in healthcare.
Awesome. Let's continue then. Let's speak about SOCI. I guess it's a big topic. Security Critical Infrastructure Act.
Yep.
Some people are going to not be as aware of what SOCI is as some other people, so I guess we'll go through a high-level overview first.
Sounds good. You're setting me up well. So look, in terms of Australia at the moment, there's probably three things that we look at from a healthcare standpoint. SOCI, Essential 8, and obviously Secure by Design. All government entities, government regulations, government frameworks that we sort of abide by from a healthcare standpoint, depending on where you sit in that realm. So not every organisation has a SOCI requirement. Some do. But every environment, healthcare should look at Essential 8 and Secure by Design in terms of getting some best practices around providing controls, but also selecting vendors based on that Secure by Design perspective. So, the SOCI Act, from a healthcare perspective, if you're looking at what it means from a healthcare and medical standpoint, it's broad, right? A system, network, facility, computer device, computer program, any other thing that touches or is deemed to be critical is an asset that must be registered. And that is complicated in some respects because um, the meaning of the asset is difficult because this doesn't drill down to what the asset types are. But the other complexity for healthcare organizations is, do they actually know what all their assets are? Do they have a complete list or a good CMDB to work out, okay, I've got a list of assets here. Which one of these would be deemed as critical? Which ones aren't, depending on their role risk, but also the relationship that you have with government and government entities. So if we look at SOC in healthcare, really there's 5 key parts that it really boils down to. Um, Hospitals in some respect are covered under critical infrastructure, but not all healthcare providers are, and not all of the MDM providers are as well. So, what we're trying to do, what's really trying to happen with SOCI is, how do you start to get better coordination around response to threat? So obviously, identification, notification, triage, and going through that cycle. So that covers not just the cyber attack on the actual instance itself, but also what's the disruption to the supply chain? Are there physical attacks, unplugging assets, getting access to physical systems? Again, it's an important perspective. How do you then look at monitoring the risks, especially coming from foreign ownership? So obviously, again, big push at the moment in protecting devices that come from some countries. So how do we control the manufacturing standards, or how do we make sure there's no backdoors in assets that are being put into healthcare environments? Making sure there's compliance with the obviously national security policies, which are really the ISM essential 8, and now really secure by design. So how do we then map towards those to get better programs in place? And then you've got your critical infrastructure assets and your CIRMP. So from a SOCI standpoint, there's quite an onerous process to go through to, again, work out whether you have requirements for SOCI, what assets you need to register for SOCI, but also what do you have you got the right programs in place from a learning standpoint. So let's look at notification or registration to start with. Um, Entities have an onerous process of providing up-to-date details. So how do then, from a healthcare environment, do you go and map all your connected devices, including OT, IoT, medical devices? That's a lot of hard work without a tool set that can actually discover and give you visibility into all those particular asset types. So now how then can you use vendors like Clarity to create an automated asset inventory that complies with the asset register for PSOs? So how do we give you the information that you need to submit around asset type? What's its critical functions? What's its risk profile look like? Who operates or uses the tool set? What are the third parties that might access it to do updates if there was an OEM involved in the process? Who owns the hospital, the healthcare facility, the clinic? Because if there's foreign interest, they have to be obviously entered into that solution as well. And then what are the dependencies that potentially create risk throughout the identification of that asset? So, are there third-party suppliers involved? Do you have backups and spares for those devices? Can they be easily patched if something goes wrong? Are there IT systems connected to it? So there's a whole raft of different things we look at to create that register of assets. And luckily, from a Clarity standpoint, we can provide customers with a pretty strong listing of what those assets look like, and we'll talk about that in a few slides' time. But then the other part of SOCI really is notification. And notification, obviously, if there's a significant impact, it has to be a 12-hour window of notification. So the challenge there is, how do you really quickly identify when an attack has occurred, and do you have the right information, the right logs, the right detail to create that submission? So initially it'll be, hey, I've had a breach, and I'm investigating the impact. But if you can give as much detail as possible as part of that breach notification, then great. That should come from a combination of all the different tool sets that you may have in that environment. And then obviously you've got the lower integrity ones, which are about more confidential, confidentiality, integrity, availability. So that's a lower level, but still it's onerous to go through that process of being able to send through that. So when we talk about it from a Clarity standpoint, we have obviously reporting and learning mechanisms that align to SOCI, and we can help you obviously extract information that's required by SOCI to submit those for you. which hopefully will alleviate some of the pain. And again, it all comes back to that first point around asset discovery and asset visibility being very, very important. And then the third part really is around cyber and information security hazards. So again, what do we do around looking at requirements around how do you evaluate the impact of hazards or services? So how do you potentially evaluate and identify the impact of an infusion pump, a different type of medical device being attacked as part of the process? What's the likelihood of that occurring? What are the potential consequences? So these are all things that we can actually do also as part of the discovery and context of those particular assets. And then what are the mitigations you have put in place to reduce that risk? So have you ensured there's access control? Do you have the right network segmentation in place? Do you have data protection around encryption and backup and those things? And do you have a good incident response program in place? Do you have good monitoring systems? Can you respond to those at the same time? Now, this is a lot of work from a SOCI standpoint. And I guess from a clarity perspective, to give you a little bit of insight, I spent sort of the last half of last year actually registering Clarity as a data storage processor to SOCI. So we have obligations like most of our customers do around that. So if I look at from a Clarity perspective, which will resonate with some customers who are going through it, we've registered our entire portfolio. So Xdome for healthcare, the Xdome Secure Access Suite, CTD, the whole lot. And as a data processor, we're required to obviously report cyber incidents. We're required to make sure that if we become aware of an incident, then we have to report that as well. We also have to go through the process of making sure we establish, maintain, and comply with a risk management program, so CIRMP on our own assets as well. So we have to go through identification processes to make sure that we are minimizing the risk that we have internally that we could potentially impact a customer, and we have to make sure we've got those listed out. So as our customers are going through the process, we've been living the same dream as well. So I'm certainly open to questions around how that works.
Jason, one of the questions that actually came through our registration form around being SOCI positive. If some of the controls are assessed and they're partially compliant, then would an approved risk action plan to remediate this be sufficient as be needed as part of a CIRMP if requested by the regulator per se? Ooh, we may have lost Jason. Sorry, guys. We'll wait for Jason to join back. He might just be having some connection issues. Just a reminder for everyone, as we're going through these slides, there are some downloadable materials on the slides in the materials tab that you can use. Have a read through them. One of them, really important, the state of CPS security for healthcare, goes through a lot of Clarity's reporting from the last year to help identify a lot of vulnerabilities and trends that we saw last year. Jason, have we got you back?
Yeah, it's weird. I think someone down the street must have dug a hole.
All good. I was just reminding our audience about our downloadable materials on the side, which support.
Perfect.
So we'll go back to the question: if some of the controls are assessed as partially compliant, would an approved risk action plan to remediate it be sufficient as part of a CIRMP?
Yes, so risk it is. So approved risk action plan is sufficient and it's also necessary as part of CRMP as well. So we've done a couple for clarity, so I understand how the process. So really, there's a couple of parts that the risk action plan has to contain. First one has to be obviously identification of the risk. So what is the asset? What's the risk that's involved? How are you trying to currently minimize and eliminate those risks? Now, some of the minimization might be controls such as network segmentation, or it could be something else depending on what the device type is. And then what's the long-term action to apply other controls where they can be applied if you're still partially compliant. The next one is obviously mitigation. So what's the impact and how are you able to mitigate the impact in the short term, but also long term by using some of those controls that you have. Documentation reporting. So obviously documenting what the risk looks like as part of the plan, what reporting you can use to identify if that risk has increased or decreased throughout the creation of that risk action plan. And then obviously improvement. What are you going to do over the next little time to obviously alleviate some of that pain? So yes, the action plan is certainly something that I've submitted, and I think it's certainly been accepted by the regulator.
Mm. And what type of evidence should be compiled to actually demonstrate compliancy when we're talking in a healthcare context? Because I guess from all different industry verticals, we're looking at different types of evidence, but healthcare specifically, what are we trying to identify?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's not so much different between industry. It's more of the same. It's around making sure that you've got all of your documentation, all of your logs, all of your results from your testing, making sure that you've got your risk identified and documented, who's responsible for what, why, and how, um, and then calling out potential areas of risk that you may see as part of that particular asset as well. So I think as long as you've got the documentation of all those different components, then that's important. Now, from a specific to a healthcare environment, it's probably a little bit deeper because you're talking about risk to potential patient safety and patient health as well. So you need to include things in there such as the third party provider, what the relationship you have with a third party provider is. Do you have contracts in place around device uptime, efficiency, those things? So anything that you have that's evidentiary around that particular asset, it's worth submitting. And my advice to people is always to over submit versus under submit if you can. So grab as much information as you have and submit that to the board, and that way you'll probably end up getting a much better outcome.
Hmm. Well, I guess directly flowing straight on from SOCI would be Essential 8, which is another Australian compliancy uh, baseline strategy. Again, some people may not be fully aware of E8, but it's a great overarching cybersecurity strategy. So we'll go through that now.
Yeah, it is, and I argue this with some people too. Essential 8 typically has been built for IT, right? So I think if you can take some of the controls and apply it to its environment, but essentially, pardon the pun, E8's really an IT tool, an IT framework, if you like. So of the 8 controls on the right hand side that you see, patching applications, operating systems, MFA, restricting administrative access, app control, etc. Some of those certainly apply to what we do from a healthcare environment. So patching where applicable, yes. Now we know that some assets can't be patched as readily as we'd like to because they're obviously in operation. So we need to wait for change windows for those. So we address those through making recommendations on compensating controls. Now, what else can we do in the meantime to alleviate some of the pain from patching? Operating systems, again, yes. Now, in an OT, well, it's not as easy to patch all like we do in a Windows environment. So we have to look at where we can patch operating systems on some of the devices, knowing that some assets that we have, even in a healthcare environment, may be 10, 15 years old. So the ability to upload or upgrade an operating system um, is not always a relevant control. And we still see some assets in healthcare, those with other industries that are still Windows 7, for example. So again, old school technology that we need to be aware of as part of that patching process. MFA and restricting administrative privileges absolutely are controls that should apply to all of your OT assets as well. So multi-factor authentication absolutely decreases the risk of getting privileged access and broadening out privileged access, because the last thing you want to do is to have someone get access to a device that doesn't have MFA or doesn't have controls in place to be able to change parameters, potentially shut down that asset, those things. And with restrictive admin controls, from an OT perspective, we always look at it as what we call ZTNA, so zero trust or lowest privilege. So what is the absolute minimum privilege that we need to apply to an asset that lets it function, lets it do what it's supposed to do, but alleviates the risk of having people with too much access being able to jump onto that asset or that device and make changes either to configuration files, to parameters around the device asset, how it's being used, and those sort of things. So we look at that. Application control probably relates more to patient management systems. So not so much an OT toolset control, but that's more of an IT toolset. So that would be something that the IT teams would look at as part of the delineation. But from a clarity perspective, because we are classed as a data processor, we have application controls for the clarity product. So we have to have multi-factor authentication and a whole bunch of other security controls that we submit to SOCI as part of our registration as well. Application hardening from an OT asset perspective is quite tough. Now, from a clarity perspective, we have obviously hardening for OS because we have to have it for FedRAMP and other things that we do with other customers. So the underlying operating systems are hardened. Some of the clinical devices don't. So we need to look at those clinical devices and work out which ones don't have application hardening as a standard, and then ask the question of the manufacturer: can we put controls in place, or can we reduce the number of services that are being used on that asset to obviously reduce risk? And backups, yes, absolutely. Backing up configurations, backing up your asset data, backing up your controls in place, certainly apply to those OT environments. So they're probably the key parts for IC in healthcare, specifically around OT and IT, where we can apply Essential 8 to those environments.
Jason, I think an important facet to note here is, I guess, compliancy to some organizations, and a lot of the feedback that we've gotten as a distributor,
Yep.
for example, compliancy to some organizations can feel like a very overwhelming, stringent, moving target. But
Yep.
a lot of compliancy standards are derivatives of larger standards. So where you may be compliant in one standard, there's a good chance you may be checking the same boxes with another standard. What are you seeing, well, from Clarity's perspective and your own perspective, what are you seeing as the biggest implementation challenge that healthcare industries face with compliancy?
It's a fantastic question. Look, I think you nailed it as you part of the question. There's a lot of thought processes that go around. We have to comply to everything, and sometimes you need to pick one that actually is going to give you the better bang for buck across multiple regulations. So, if I look at most healthcare environments that have, let's talk even region as well. Some have HIPAA, some have other things, but they're not going to go down a path of actually trying to do those individually in silos, because they end up creating a black hole and not realizing that they've actually created more mess for themselves and more work. So looking at healthcare, we typically look at NIST CSF as a good control that we start with. We'll look at ISO 27001, obviously, and those two give you a good framework around policy and process from an ISO perspective. Controls in place from a NIST perspective seem to be a good starting point for most organizations. If you look at where Essential 8 and the government ISM really relate, they actually come, for the most part, from NIST, and they've been modified to suit Australian conditions. So they're good starting points. Now, if you can use those two frameworks to give you 95, 96% of your coverage, then that to me is a much better use of your time versus having to try and individually go through everything. So if you can go through and do a NIST CSF audit on yourself or an assessment yourself and work out that you've got most of those controls in place, or you're moving towards getting most of those controls in place, you'd cover Essential 8, you'd probably cover most of the other regulatory requirements, other than SOCI, because SOCI is more difficult because it's about asset registration. But I think that's probably a good angle, and that's one that we recommend to customers who are confused like we get sometimes. If I look at clarity from a regulatory standpoint, I think we're supporting 40, 50 different controls globally. Now, that's too onerous for an individual customer to go through.
Hmm. And I think you just touched on it briefly, but what would you recommend as the process for testing Essential 8 maturity level 1 controls when they are actually implemented?
Look, I think the Essential 8 assessment itself is probably the best place to start. So if you jump onto the ASD website or cyber.gov.au, they actually have an assessment process for ML1. Um, I typically go there as a starting point because I think if you go through that baseline of testing, then it gives you pretty good grounding. Now you'll have individual tool sets that you'll use as part of that assessment, but if you want a really good structured assessment process, then the one at cyber.gov.au is a good starting point for that. And it will actually help you think about things not just around the tool, but what else do I need to think about as part of that risk mitigation process? People, process, technology, the three things we always talk about. I think that assessment pretty much covers all three pretty well. Now, you might want to have a third party company to work for you too, but for the most part, if you follow that checklist that they have, I think it holds you in pretty good stead in terms of being able to come out with a good outcome that's going to show you areas where you need to improve or areas where you're partially compliant. And because you've been through that assessment process, you'll understand exactly what the requirement is to go and make those resolutions.
Hmm. Well, I guess moving on to the next section, we're going to be talking about the Secure by Design guide. We've briefly touched on it a couple of times in this webinar,
Yep.
actually, but talking about um, vulnerabilities due to having unsupported systems and unpatched vulnerabilities. So I guess we'll get straight into that one as well.
Yeah, it's a good segue. Look, and I think scuba design is important for organizations that are looking at acquiring medical devices, medical assets in this context of this call today. Um, so what Secure by Design really gives you is the ability to ask the manufacturers around, well, what are they doing from a credentialing standpoint to improve their own security on their product? And where this is really born out of is that we see a lot of IoT devices that are consumer grade. They don't have the same controls in place that a enterprise or commercial asset would have. So, you think of CCTV cameras, those things that you have around your home, they typically have default passwords applied when they send to you. They pretty much for the most part, have an inbuilt internet connection to send information to somewhere, and they're unregulated, uncontrolled. So what we're trying to do, or what ASD is trying to do with Secure by Design from a healthcare perspective is, can I limit the exposure of medical assets or medical devices from risks that should be resolved at the factory? So why can't the manufacturer put in these controls? Why can't they mandate MFA? Why can't they lock down services? Why do they have to have a third party internet connection? These things should be part of that process. The other part of scuba design is over the life cycle of that asset, what do we need to do around making sure that there's vulnerability management, there's threat intelligence, there's updates, there's incident response, because the last thing you want to do is have, for example, let's pick an MRI machine, an expensive machine that's probably going to have a 10 to 15 year life cycle. It's not something that you can set and forget, because at some point there's going to be vulnerabilities that occur on that asset because of either the way it's connected or because there's vulnerabilities that have been found around the underlying operating system that potentially causes risk. So you need to make sure that the organizations that are selling these assets to you or these devices to you have lifecycle support throughout the journey. Supply chain transparency is really important, and not just from an SBOM and HBOM perspective, so software bill of material and hardware bill of materials, but also, can they prove to you that they're following secure development practices? OWASP, for example, do they follow a certain process for software development? Do they have controls in place around how they build the physical asset that they apply the software to? What's the manufacturing standard like? Do they have supply chain redundancy? So, for example, if a key medical device is being sent to you and it breaks, and the supply chain is broken, is there a backup supply chain to be able to create parts and send you parts to fix those issues? So, what it's really trying to do is it's trying to, as I said to you, trying to make things that uh, making sure that the assets that you buy, medical devices you buy, don't end up being cyber dead, which means they become vulnerable or obsolete because unsupported systems, unpatched, or end of life. And that's really the whole purpose of secure by design. So I think it's a really good initiative by the government to do that, because it actually gives you as the customer an opportunity to ask, your key manufacturers or your key providers, do you have these things in place? Because if I know that you do, and I've got that in writing from you, either contractually or through other means, I know that I have a lesser chance of increasing my risk landscape through your device than I do maybe with another device type that's in the environment.
Jason, before we move on to the next section, um, a question from myself, actually, I guess. What strategies can be employed uh, by the consumer to ensure consumer demand and expect secure products and services while we have this guide?
Yeah, look, this probably isn't so much for consumer. This is more around entities that are in high risk environments. But even from a consumer standpoint, the best way to make a manufacturer change their model is to go and use your feet and buy something else. A competing
Yeah,
product is usually the best way to do it.
yeah,
But we don't have that. We
and
don't necessarily have that luxury in these environments. So, from a healthcare perspective, sometimes those devices are very, very specific, and you don't have a chance to go to another provider because they don't exist. So that's where ASD helps. Is this is putting pressure back on the manufacturer? So a different type of pressure, but yeah, for the most part, consumers walk, right. They go and buy other stuff, and then people wonder why they're not getting traction from their product when they realize that their competing product has other controls, features, functions in place that are more beneficial to the end user.
and I guess flowing on from that, how does the secure by design approach, I guess, influence the product development life cycle for the technology manufacturer on the other side?
Yeah, yeah. Look, the technology manufacturers should be aware of these guidelines, and they would have to be, because obviously they're actually getting started to get asked questions from hospitals and clinics around, hey, can you provide me this information that I need? So the more that information is requested, the more that the medical device manufacturers will actually have to start to take it seriously. And look, we see it in other parts of the world. Look at the US and Europe, where this sort of thing has been in place for quite a while. It's actually beneficial for us because they're already seeing competing pressure in other regions, and we now coming to a table with the same responses. So those manufacturers should already have these practices in place.
Hmm. Well, I think this gives a really good overview of some of these, I guess, some of these standards and regulations. Um, I guess let's go into how clarity actually assists with vulnerability exposure, in-depth visibility, device profiling. I'm sure we'll get quite a few questions on this one.
Perfect. So look, the foundation for healthcare really is around asset visibility and discovery. That's the key component. And we say, you can't protect what you can't see. So in the life of a healthcare environment, there's a couple of things that we do. We want to make sure that we are also leveraging different discovery methods to identify the key assets in the environment. We want to make sure that we're doing deep packet inspection, and looking at existing ecosystem data, so we're not having any impact. We're not creating a situation where we're impacting medical devices. We're making sure we are still supporting the key clinical workflows in the environment, but we're also making sure we're tailored to operational constraints. And operational constraints might be, we can't grab asset information from this device unless it's between these hours because it's in place, it's being used. So you're not going to do an asset discovery mid surgery or mid something else that happens from a clinical perspective, because that's impacting. So how do we make sure that we do those discoveries at times that actually make more sense for the information to be recovered? So the way we do it is, yes, we have passive scanning that runs across the network, but we also have active scanning and what we call edge, where we're able to get a really deep contextual level of information around what that asset's doing, what its behavior is, what its risk profile looks like. And that really then gives you a really strong example of, okay, now I understand my landscape. I can move on into getting a much much better visibility across my purpose-built medical devices. So, for example, we would use the MDS or the SBOM from manufacturers to identify operating system applications, refining vulnerability correlation example. We also have, really strong relationships with the MDMs. So, looking at currently for our MDM alliances from a clarity standpoint, we've got 1.45 million pairs across 240 different MDMs. So that's a really strong library of asset information that we have that can create and confirm vulnerability and help us to make recommended remediations and compensating controls. Edge is something that we use from an active scan standpoint where we can grab information around more host information. So not just the OS and version or IP, but more around what are the other things it's doing, what are potential vulnerabilities, what tags do they have, what software versions that are running, what is their role within a medical process to allow us then to really extract out more granular and compartmentalized information that's comprehensive that then allows us to focus on what we do from a risk and vulnerability standpoint. And then the last part is device visibility. So as we mentioned very early in the piece, we're not just looking at IP devices. These devices have different protocols, very different ways of communicating. So how do we then look at two things? One is identifying those different protocols through the clarity expertise, but also just as important is how do we do integration with the MDM device managers? So, looking at a Siemens or a Philips, or those devices have their own device management systems. Can we integrate into those to send and extract data that helps build out that key asset process? And that's the strength of clarity. And just as an example, in terms of depth and breadth, looking at, and we mentioned Fusion Pump a couple of times, but here's a great example. So typically we want the networking information because that helps us to create a picture of what it's talking to, what network segmentation is in place, what zoning is in place, all these things that we want to know about, what switches are connected to, where's it connected to. So from a troubleshooting standpoint, we not only can say this device has got an issue or it's vulnerable, but here's where it's actually physically located to reduce the troubleshooting time. That's the whole purpose of that networking piece. From an clinical engineering standpoint, we want to know what it is, what it does, and is it critical, yes or no? So we capture that information as well. And then from a security standpoint, if we know what the operating system type is, we know what the versions are, we also then can identify vulnerabilities in particular versions, and we give them a much better chance of identifying, do they have enough controls in place to make that device less vulnerable, or are there other controls we can put in place or recommend to make sure that that key asset is protected much better than it would be. So so looking at this really builds out a picture of here's part of the device visibility that we use. And we use that because when we move into things such as vulnerability exposure and exposure management, we won't just give customers a list of here's the 5,000 CVEs in your environment. We'll actually say you might have all these CVEs, but when we enrich that data from CISA and give you the KEV, as in known exploited vulnerability, we actually say, yes, you've got 1,000 alerts for CVE, but guess what? Here's the 12 things that actually can be exploited in your environment. Go and resolve those. So we're actually reducing the administrative overhead significantly by focusing on the key areas that you should go and resolve and give you priorities. So what are the priority groups? What are the priority types? How do we go and resolve those? What are the other comms and controls we can put in place to make sure that they're actively resolved? So again, instead of focusing on those 1,000 CVs that mean nothing to you, let's focus on known exploited vulnerabilities that can be and will be exploited in your environment based on the parameters that you have in place today, so you can go resolve those. And that's a really significant move away from vulnerability management to now exposure management. So giving you exposure information, but giving you the remediation to go and fix those in a much more timely fashion, knowing that you can't patch everything. So what else can we do to make sure that control is in place? So the 5 key tenets that we look at from a clarity standpoint are really, again, exposure management. So prioritization, risk assessment, and really good reporting capabilities that can be used for compliance regulations. Network protection. So out of the box, we look at what the assets are doing from a communication standpoint. Who are they talking to? What are they talking to? And from there, there's 2 things that come out of it. We can identify whether those assets are talking to potentially an external communication point that they don't know they have or we can't identify other than the comms plan, but also making sure that you've got the ability to send recommendations like ACLs or file rules to your switches and firewalls to help create really strong controls there that are network based. Secure access is one that we're seeing probably the number one target from a risk standpoint at the moment. So 82% of organizations in the last 12 months have had a breach through secure access or a third party getting access to an asset. And most of the time it's either two things. One is that a customer doesn't have an audit list of the connections in the last 12 months. So who's been logging into what? Most don't know that. But also there's 6 or 7 different secure access tool sets that are built for IT that don't necessarily work on the IT side, and they're creating issues through secure access as well. So that's something that we see a lot of in healthcare. Threat detections around, again, with that clinical context we've captured from the asset discovery, we can actually protect patient safety because we've given you threats that apply to your specific environment. And then the last thing that we don't talk about from a risk standpoint is operational efficiency. So if we can look at all of the assets that you have and look at utilization, location information, operational status, etc., how can we help healthcare organizations improve operations by looking at, okay, you've got 6 MRI machines, 2 are running at 110%, you've got one here that runs at 30%. Is it in the right location? Is it doing the right thing? So how do we move those around to create a much more balanced operational efficiency standpoint? That's a tool set that comes out. But the underpinning point around that is all around that comprehensive asset inventory. Without that, none of these other things in your environment are going to actually make any difference. So from an outcome standpoint, there's 5 key outcomes that we have from a Clarity standpoint when it comes to healthcare compliance. It's all about risk reduction, threat management, regulatory compliance, operational efficiency, and optimizing medical device utilization in a better way, with the ultimate goal of improving patient safety. And all of these things here are measurable. So you can have, obviously measurable risk reduction through the tool set, through the reports we give you. And we know from our existing customer fleet that, I won't read all these out, but these are the typical risk reductions that we see by deploying Clarity into medical or clinical environments. So again, 18% risk reduction with extensive implementation, 47% risk reduction. So these are huge numbers, and they all come about because that asset discovery visibility is also the most important piece of your journey towards not just compliance, but removing or reducing your risk landscape, because you've identified where you have and you can apply controls to those things that you have. So it all sounds pretty complicated, but at the crux of it, there's probably 5 key steps. And really, when we talk to healthcare customers, this is the 5-step action plan that we sort of talk about. And obviously, yes, we build this out into more detail, but really it's around scoping. So, what are the device types or the key processes that you have by device type and department? Going around then discovery those devices, the attributes, the communication map that they currently have, the prioritization of a security framework. So again, we mentioned NIST or ISO 27001. If they're the ones that are right for your business based on impact and exploit, then great. We'll help you map through those to create that exploitability of exposure in your environment. We then go through that validation process to make sure that you're getting real exposure and real remediation. And then the last part is helping you to reduce risk by giving you actionable mitigations and remediations that your team can go on perform versus trying to guess what happens based on a bunch of alerts that might not be necessary for your particular environment. So that's pretty much the 5-step plan that we go through. And then to help today, obviously we'll send you a lot more detail around the compliance. So we've got a new white paper that we released last week called Choosing Secure Technology in Australia's Healthcare Ecosystem. Really maps out in more detail how we map to SOCI, how we help you map to Essential 8. We go through ASD, so we'll actually give you a lot more detail around the key tenets around all of those regulations and how Clarity product applies to it. And then I think in the download today through this webinar, you've got the ability to download the state of CPS security specific to healthcare, which is something that our Team 82 research team came up with. So they're great documents to download and read. hopefully that gives you a lot more information that you can then go and use in your environments to help alleviate some of the regulatory pain.
Awesome. Well, being conscious of time, I know that we didn't manage to get through every single question that came through registration, but I want to thank Jason wholeheartedly for joining us today. I think you've given us an amazing overview and an in-depth explanation of this very complex cyber landscape in the healthcare space and all the different facets of this space. And I want to thank the audience as well for joining. Like Jason just mentioned, a quick reminder, um, those downloadable materials are just in the tab to the right under materials. You can download those and use those. And of course, if we didn't get to your question, we'll definitely get an answer back to you as soon as possible. This recording is going to be available and it will be distributed after this. But we are unfortunately going to wrap up another great webinar. Thank you again, Jason. Really, really appreciate you being here, and
Thanks,
thank you to
Marcus.
all. No worries. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. And if you do have any further questions, please feel free to send them through to our Connected Health team. But thanks, everyone. Enjoy.